Then out of nowhere, Johnny, one of the teachers, walked in. And I mean Johnny, I've got to admit, he was good looking. Like really good looking. Tall, dark hair, that kind of presence that made everyone turn their heads when he entered the room. He was also very aware that I found him attractive. We'd had a little fling, nothing serious, just a one-time thing, but there was something about him that made me feel like I could let go of the constant stress for just a little while. The kind of feeling that makes you do something impulsive. Right now, I was in the mood to do something a little out of character. He strolled into my office, leaning casually against the doorframe with that cocky smile of his. "You look stressed, Miss Miller," he said. And trust me, it wasn't just the stress he was referring to. I forced a smile. "It's just the usual paperwork. Nothing I can't handle." Johnny raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "You sure? You look like you could use a little help unwinding." Before I could even say anything, just as I was about to brush him off, a few of the other teachers walked into my office. 3 of them to be exact, each holding reports and updates about their respective classes. Of course, they had to go through the boring stuff with me, things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but Johnny's presence lingered, and for a moment all I could think about was how much I wanted to escape. Escape from all of this. But duty calls, right? So I turned my attention back to the teachers, listening to their updates. It was all just routine stuff, but Johnny, he wasn't leaving. He stayed there, watching me as the others talked. I could feel his eyes on me, and honestly, it was a distraction, a very unwelcome distraction. And then, right in the middle of the meeting, my sister walked into the office. Now, my sister is, let's say she's got a very different perspective on things. She's always been the free spirit in the family, the one who does whatever feels right in the moment. She didn't waste any time either. "Guess what I just found out about?" she asked, her eyes practically sparkling with excitement. I was already annoyed with the situation, so I snapped. "What?" She leaned in, almost whispering as though she was about to drop some huge secret.
"Swinger party.
People are planning one around here. You should throw one yourself." I froze for a moment. I thought I misheard her. "What did you just say?" I asked. "A swing party," she repeated. "It's all the rage right now. People are meeting up, having a good time, and it's totally private. You could do one here at your school. No one would ever know." I stared at her in disbelief. Was she really suggesting I organize something like that? Me, the principal of a school? The idea seemed so out of left field that I had to laugh. But the more she talked about it, the more it started to sink in. I mean, I was already feeling overwhelmed with everything going on at the school. I hadn't taken a real break in forever, and suddenly the idea of doing something completely unexpected seemed almost appealing. "You're joking, right?" I asked, still unsure whether she was serious. "Why not?" she said. "I bet it'd be an amazing way to let off some steam. Just a few close friends, you know? Nothing big, just fun." And there it was. The seed was planted. At first, I thought it was a joke. But then the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I was constantly under pressure, dealing with difficult parents and teachers. I had so little time for myself, and the idea of just escaping for one night felt so tempting. So, despite all my better judgment, I decided to do it. I made a plan, kept it low-key, invited a small group of people, teachers I trusted, no outsiders, and arranged for everything to be discreet. No one would know. No one would get hurt, right? I was nervous but also excited. Maybe this was the break I needed, a night to let go and have fun without worrying about school or anything else. Little did I know, that decision would spiral into something I couldn't have prepared for. The party was set for the following Saturday. Everything was arranged. The office was locked, the school was empty, and only the teachers I trusted would be coming. It was going to be low-key, just a way to unwind after what felt like an eternity of stress. I had everything under control, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. As the day approached, I found myself feeling a mix of nervous excitement. I hadn't had a moment like this in years, a moment where I wasn't the strict principal or the leader people turned to. I was just going to be me for once. I told myself it was harmless. After all, it was just one night. The afternoon of the party, I kept busy with last-minute preparations, clearing my desk, making sure everything looked presentable. It was strange, though. There was an energy in the air. I kept imagining what it would be like when everyone arrived, what conversations we would have, what kind of boundaries would be pushed. Would they judge me? Or would they understand? Would they look at me differently after tonight? At 6:30 p.m., the first few teachers started trickling in. Johnny, of course, was the first to arrive. He walked in like he owned the place, a smile on his face that made my heart race for reasons I didn't want to admit. I could tell he was excited, maybe even more than I was. He caught my eye as soon as he walked in and winked. I didn't know whether to be flattered or scared by the way he made me feel so alive with just a glance. I tried to calm myself down, forcing myself to stay in the moment.
This wasn't supposed to be about that. It was just a party. A release.
As everyone else filed in, I could tell my guests weren't quite sure what to expect. Some of them, like the older teachers, were hesitant at first, looking around as if they were waiting for someone else to make the first move. But as the evening went on, the atmosphere slowly began to shift. The tension from the work week, the stress, the deadlines, everything seemed to melt away. People were laughing, joking around, letting go of the walls they usually built around themselves at work. I wasn't the principal anymore. I was just a woman at a party. We sat in a circle, music playing softly in the background, and I found myself talking freely for the first time in what felt like forever. Johnny was always close by, his gaze never quite leaving me. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, drawing me in with every word, every laugh, every look. The others seemed to blend into the background as my focus narrowed onto him. The chemistry between us was undeniable. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so alive. The world outside the walls of the school didn't matter anymore. In that moment, I could just breathe. But then it happened. I wasn't expecting it. As I was standing by the table, refilling my glass, I heard the faintest creak from the door. At first, I thought it was nothing. Just the wind, or maybe the house settling. But then the door swung open, and I froze. My blood turned to ice as I looked up to see who had just entered. It was him, the deputy, the one I was supposed to meet. I hadn't forgotten, but in the heat of the moment, I hadn't thought to lock the door. I thought the school was completely empty, and I had completely forgotten about him coming for our budget meeting. His eyes widened in shock as they scanned the room. It was like a movie scene. The world seemed to slow down, my pulse racing as I watched him take in the situation. There he was, standing in the doorway of my office, clearly unprepared for the scene he had just walked into. For a split second, I thought maybe he hadn't seen what he'd just walked in on. Maybe he'd come at the wrong time.
But no.
He saw it all. The teachers, the music, the relaxed atmosphere that was anything but professional. He just stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at me. His face went from surprise to something else I couldn't quite place. His eyes flicked over to the teachers in the room, their faces frozen in horror. I wanted to speak, to say something, but I couldn't. My mind raced, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched on like an eternity, heavy with guilt and shame. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice shaking, almost in disbelief. What is going on here?" In that moment, I knew my life had just turned upside down. I had been foolish, letting myself get lost in a moment, not thinking about the consequences. I had failed to protect myself, to protect my reputation, to protect my career. But it didn't stop there. The moment he spoke, it felt like everything shifted. The room, which had been full of laughter and relaxed conversation, suddenly fell into an unbearable silence. Everyone's eyes darted nervously between each other, clearly unsure of what to do next. The deputy was still standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of shock, confusion, and something else, something that I couldn't quite identify, but it felt like disappointment. His gaze locked onto mine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt small. I tried to regain some semblance of control, but it was like my body had forgotten how to move. I opened my mouth to explain, to do something, but nothing came out. I just stood there, frozen. Johnny, who had been standing by my side moments earlier, seemed to realize the gravity of the situation before anyone else. He shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. Deputy, we were just But the deputy cut him off with a wave of his hand, still looking at me. I don't want to hear it. I really don't. His voice was trembling with anger, but there was something else underneath that, something deeper. His face twisted with something I couldn't quite grasp, but it wasn't just the shock anymore. It was hurt. I felt the weight of his stare, and my heart sank. I knew this wasn't just about the party anymore. It wasn't about what we were doing or what was supposed to be a fun, harmless escape. There was something personal here, something I had never expected. What the hell is going on, Miss Millers? The words were out before he could stop himself, and I could hear the rawness in his voice. There was a sharp edge to it, like a blade being dragged across the floor. The others stood there, unsure, their eyes bouncing between us like they didn't know how to handle what had just unfolded. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like I couldn't breathe. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding louder and louder. It felt like everything I had worked for, the reputation I had built, the life I had so carefully crafted, was crumbling, piece by piece, right before my eyes. I had done this. I had allowed this. I don't know what you saw, I finally stammered, trying to make sense of it all, but the words didn't feel right. They felt like a weak excuse. The deputy didn't even flinch as he stared at me, and that look, one of shock, betrayal, and disgust, cut through me like nothing else could. His eyes shifted to the others in the room, the teachers who had been part of this madness, the teachers who had been just as reckless as I was in their own ways. They all looked guilty, and I felt their shame in the air like a suffocating fog. Then, just when I thought I might collapse from the pressure, the deputy spoke again. His voice was quieter this time, almost like he was trying to hold back tears. You don't get it, do you? He shook his head, his voice cracking with emotion. I trusted you. Those words hit harder than anything. The deputy, someone I'd worked with, someone who had always respected me, had trusted me. And I had shattered that trust. I could see it in his eyes, the raw pain of feeling betrayed by someone who had always seemed so steady, so in control. My own heart ached with the weight of his words. I wanted to apologize, to explain everything. But nothing I said would be enough.
Not now.
I'm sorry. I managed, but it felt hollow. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had already made up his mind. His face was now set in a rigid expression, and I could see the decision forming in his eyes. He was going to do what I feared most. The deputy took a few steps back, never breaking eye contact. Then, in one swift motion, he turned toward the door, his voice rising with a force I didn't expect. You're fired, Miss Miller. His words felt like a blow to my chest. The room went completely still. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think. The words rang in my ears, each one heavier than the last. The reality of what I had just heard began to set in. The deputy stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him with such force that it shook the walls. I felt my knees give out, and I stumbled into the chair behind me, gripping the edge of the desk for support. It was like the ground had been ripped from beneath me. I stared at the door, at the empty space where the deputy had just stood, and my mind raced with 1,000 questions. How had this happened? How had a simple act of trying to have fun turned into the complete destruction of everything I had built? There was no going back now. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I was still sitting there, frozen, with the realization of what had just happened sinking in. I couldn't hear anything but the pounding in my head. The room was spinning, the weight of what had just unfolded crashing down on me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything, but it was too late for logic now. The deputy had left. The damage had been done. I turned to look at the teachers who had been there, the ones who had been part of this disastrous decision. They were still standing, frozen in place, eyes wide, expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. The air between us was thick with regret and guilt, and I could feel it, the overwhelming, suffocating guilt that came with knowing that my one impulsive decision had ruined not only my career but the trust of everyone around me. Johnny was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward, his voice soft, hesitant. Miss Miller? I didn't expect this. I cut him off with a sharp wave of my hand, not wanting to hear anything more from him. This wasn't about him, or anyone else in this room.
It was about me.
It was my decision, my fault. I felt the sting of tears in my eyes, but I blinked them back. I couldn't afford to cry right now. Not when everything was crumbling so quickly. But how could I not? The weight of my actions was overwhelming. I had been so careless, so reckless. And now, I was facing the consequences, and they were worse than anything I could have imagined. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The others slowly started to leave, one by one, their faces marked with the same guilt and shame I was feeling. Nobody said a word. Nobody knew what to say. They all just left. Finally, I was alone in my office. The music, once a soothing background to our laughter, now seemed like a cruel reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I sat there, alone, in the silence that felt louder than anything else. I heard a faint knock on the door. My sister. She stepped inside hesitantly, her expression filled with concern. She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the same panic that had been in my own eyes only moments ago. I heard, she said quietly, her voice shaking. Is everything okay? I laughed bitterly, the sound almost foreign to my own ears.
No.
Nothing's okay. I looked at her, frustration bubbling up inside me. I ruined everything, you know that? Everything I've worked for, gone in a matter of minutes. I've lost my job, my career, and it's all because I was so desperate for something different. A break.
And now?
Now I have nothing. My voice cracked as the words spilled out, raw and unfiltered. I hadn't meant to let this all out, but I couldn't stop myself. She walked over, sitting next to me, her hand resting on mine. I never meant for this to happen, you know that, right? I thought it would be fun. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't answer her. What could I say? How could I explain that I had brought this upon myself, that I had let my own need for escape cloud my judgment? I didn't think it through, I whispered. I should have thought it through. I never should have. I stopped, taking a deep breath, trying to push back the overwhelming feeling of failure that was rising in my chest. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and legal documents. The deputy had gone straight to the authorities, reporting everything. My actions had been deemed a violation of the law. The law. I had used a public school as the backdrop for a private event, and I had violated multiple professional and legal codes. I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, like a weight that couldn't be lifted. The police came to my door. I wasn't prepared for that. I never thought it would go this far.
But it did.
And just like that, I was arrested. Handcuffed. The humiliation was overwhelming. I had never imagined that my life would take such a sharp turn. The trial came quickly. It felt like a whirlwind, courtrooms, lawyers, accusations flying left and right. The shame, the guilt, it was suffocating. The truth was I was in the wrong. I had made a foolish decision, and now my entire career, everything I had built, was on the line. And then came the sentencing, 6 months in prison. I could barely believe it. 6 months. How had it all gone so wrong? I managed to pay the $25,000 bail, and I was released while I appealed the sentence, but I was still in shock. My whole world felt like it was shattering piece by piece. I couldn't stay in the town that had been my home for so long. I couldn't face the people who knew me. The whispers, the looks, I couldn't escape them. So I packed my bags and moved. Miami seemed like the only option, a fresh start. I needed to get away from the memories, from the shame that clung to me like a second skin. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the consequences. Now, more than 6 months have passed since that night. I've started over in Miami, working as a principal at a new school. It's been a slow climb, but I'm doing well. I've learned from my mistakes, and I'm rebuilding my life, one step at a time. As for the deputy, I never knew he was in love with me. I never even had an inkling. He never told me, not when he walked in on me that night, not ever. But when I saw the hurt in his eyes, I realized what I had done, what I had lost. So, my conclusion to all of this? Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't let one moment of weakness destroy everything you've worked for. Follow the law, respect the boundaries, and never, ever forget what matters most.